Cling. It's traffic. I'm Jim Telemonte on AM 560 The Answer.
Chicago's Morning Answer continues next. Your official Chicagoland weather forecast. From the 1-hour heating and air conditioning weather center, sunny to partly cloudy through the midday. Strong afternoon to evening storms could pop up, high 86. Currently 59. Next news at 7. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560 The Answer.
Make sure to check out the Income Store live video stream of today's show right now at 560theanswer.com.
When you've got questions, he always has an answer. It's Sean Hannity this afternoon at 2, right before Joe Walsh at 5 on AM 560 The Answer.
Dan and Amy, so again, we were talking earlier about Lori the Lightfoot's State of the City address tonight at 6 o'clock, where she's going to lay out her budget proposal, how she's going to close $1 billion budget, operating budget deficit. She wants
the math just doesn't.
She wants to increase sales taxes on services. She's property tax increase. I don't know what else she has in store, but it'll be the same thing.
How's that hotel tax going for the artists, artisan community?
There'll be no discussion of cuts. There'll be only a discussion of funding a status quo that has proved unfinanceable, as we were discussing. And against this backdrop, you have this impasse with Chicago Teachers Union, the prospect of a strike by late September if they don't reach a deal after CTU rejected a 16% increase over 5 years. And the city embraced it, not having any idea where they're going to come up with the money unless they want to, of course, increase property taxes over there at CPS as well, the junk-rated Chicago public school system. Speaking of CTU, just laying all our cards on the table as we're going to be subjected to another 3 weeks of the Workers of the World Unite rhetoric from Chicago Teachers Union Politburo Chairman Jesse Sharkey. If you didn't know this about Jesse Sharkey, you should. And I understand that hypocrisy is the point with the left because it shows that they play by a different set of rules.
I thought he was a middle-income, hardworking union member teacher.
The CTU boss, that's a few $100,000. So there's nothing middle income about it, number one, but he doesn't even need it. Number two, because Jesse Sharkey lives with his wife and kids in a $1.5 million Rogers Park estate, 4 bedrooms, 2nd floor patio, 3rd floor master retreat, sunroom. He's got a Tesla, which I believe is non-union automaker. Again, hypocrisy is status for the left. I don't play by the same rules you have to play by. It's 3 lots across a short walk from Lake Michigan. How does he do it? His father-in-law is Richard Fain, a Republican financier who owns and operates Royal Caribbean Cruises. It's interesting, the CTU gets into a lot of topic areas beyond the education of children, like a living wage, right? They're out there, the red shirts, protesting McDonald's for not paying a living wage, $15. $15 an hour. Royal Caribbean Cruises was fined $750,000 by the Justice Department for overworking crew members and $18 million for illegally dumping oil and hazardous waste. I haven't heard Jesse Sharkey or CTU take a position on Royal Caribbean Cruises. I wonder why that is. He writes about his the wealth he married into. We don't choose the family of our loved ones. I can only imagine his father-in-law believes the same. I have a lovely wife. We have children. I live in a house in Rogers Park and only have one of them.
Only have one house?
He only has one house. He only has one.
Everybody has a second home in Michigan, or
he only has one $1.5 million home.
Just like send him a fruit basket.
Just like everybody, regular guy. And I send my kids to public schools. He does send his kids to public schools. However,
let me guess. I got into selective enrollment.
Correct.
Did they?
His kids go to Magna and selective enrollment schools miles away from his home, even though he's got a pretty good school, public school, neighborhood school right there in Rogers Park. But, again, for me, not for thee.
There's always Amundsen.
For me, not for thee should be the motto of the political ruling class in the state. Well, it is to me. And this is Chicago is a prime example, but it's a microcosm of what's going on in urban centers around the world, around the country, I should say. Well, sure, around the world too. Obviously, the further you get from America, the more socialist you get. But that's the deal here. And it's the same thing we've talked about in San Francisco and LA. They've just layered on public health crises engendered by the failure of their municipal governments. And for more on that topic, we're pleased to be joined by Steve Malagna. He is the contributing editor to City Journal, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Steve, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
How are you?
Good. What about urban finances and these seemingly intractable problems of safety and K through 12 education, and I don't know, keeping poop off the streets that a lot of municipalities around the country are faced with?
Well, the piece that I wrote is about how we went through a period of urban decline in America in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s that actually, there was a lot of external circumstances, some external circumstances like deindustrialization, jobs left the cities. But what also happened is that the response to these problems by our policymakers, the people who ran cities and the people in Washington, was a lot of bad policies. The idea that, for instance, when crime rose during this period, well, it was because America's economic system was unjust, and therefore the cops shouldn't really enforce crime. They should step back, And in our social programs, the idea was programs that had been, means tested since the 1930s, but were temporary, like welfare, became permanent because, again, our system was unjust. What this led to, of course, was rising, ever more rising crime and a really intergenerational, what we call dependency, people growing up on welfare and then having children who also grew up on welfare. And we saw tremendous, astounding problems. I mean, in New York City, which I've written about quite a lot, we topped out at 2,200 murders a year in the early 1990s. Now, the thing is, we actually started reversing this in the 90s because we looked at all this and said, wait a minute, we've got it exactly backwards. Voters finally said enough and started electing people who say we've got it exactly backwards, and we started doing things like enforcing low-level crime, because the people who commit low-level crime are also the people who are wanted for much more serious crime. We made an effort to end dependency, and we certainly made some headway in that. Also, get people back into the workforce where they're more productive. And we saw the benefits of this in a lot of ways, especially we went through this tremendous era. We've been going through this tremendous era of urban revival in America, which is really centered around declining crime and, rising work. Now, though, I think we've seen enough of this so that you have around America progressive politicians who've been elected in places. You look at New York City, where after 20 years of a Republican and a moderate Democrat in Mike Bloomberg, you've got de Blasio, who's a progressive, and the progressives are essentially reinstituting the kind of policies that we saw in the 1970s, the 1980s. And what you see as a result of that is this rising disorder again. Places like San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, they're no longer enforcing low-level drug laws. And so as a result of that, you've open-air drug markets in places like that where the homeless come. People are coming from around the country to live on the streets in these places where they can buy drugs freely, where they get, they get coupons for food and so forth. And they've essentially created, homeless encampments. You mentioned the poop problem, if you will, in San Francisco. There's a saying now in San Francisco that even the dogs have to be careful where they step. So so essentially what's happening is we are unlearning the lessons that we learned after seeing the social disorder decades ago and seeing how to, if you will, cure it. We've managed to elect a whole series of politicians who are kind of essentially going back, and their philosophy really is, America is an unjust economic system. People are living on the streets because they can't afford apartments or they can't afford a place to live. Never mind that overwhelmingly the people on the streets are people who have addiction and mental health problems.
Exactly.
It's really not about our economic system.
They don't want help because the Lakeshore Drive, Uptown Viaduct tent city that was set up, they offered them Section 8 housing. Then they said, and we'll pay your rent for 3 months. And they said, no, they don't want to live in a home. They want to live on the streets. They want the freedom of that. But yeah.
Yes,
Sure.
exactly right.
Al
So-
fresco.
yeah.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
tonight's
yeah.
budget address, since somehow we can't seem to cut spending in the city, what is she going to? How is she gently going to say, "Hey, folks, I'm going to have to raise your property taxes"?
Well, you see, here's the excuse, of course, in a place like Chicago for a while has been we have this intractable problem which the state is pushing down on us, and that's the pension problem. You know, the previous property tax, the Rahm Emanuel property tax increases, were all about, and this is true, you know, we totally messed up the pension system, and then the state passed legislation which said you have to start making your payments, and they didn't offer any alternatives for how to reduce costs. So, you know, you get a $500 million property tax increase. All of Chicago's property taxes that they collect are now going to the pension system. So what you've had is this in the same thing in Seattle. I'll give you an example. I don't know if you remember, there was this whole discussion about the Amazon tax that they passed out there. It was a tax that they were going to tax all Amazon and everybody else out there, and it was $100 million. And the whole idea is we need it for homelessness, we need it for subsidized housing. What they didn't say is that Seattle has this tremendous pension problem, and they're now paying $100 million a year just to pay down the pension debt. $100 million is exactly what the Amazon tax was going to be. So the money really is kind of like has gone into the pension system, and now they're saying, well, we have these social problems, and we can't ignore them, so we have to keep raising your taxes. And this is a problem that a whole bunch of American cities have because they have this debt, and the level of debt is really so high at this particular point, and they just can't ignore it. I mean, you know, we can talk about cities going bankrupt, although in Illinois, the state government doesn't even allow cities to file for bankruptcy. So you do have this kind of intractable problem, but a lot of the problem is that years of mismanagement is coming home kind of to roost in terms of financial mismanagement.
Well, that's right. And so 2019, the city will spend 40 cents on every dollar on debt, on bonded debt indebtedness as well as pensions, and doing so doesn't change the trajectory of the city's biggest pension funds, police, fire, laborers, all of which are under 25% funded, circling the drain. And so it seems to me the argument, and everybody has this conversation in Illinois, well, how do we get out of it? What's going to happen? When is it going to happen? But ultimately, until my view, I'm interested in yours, an expert in this space. My view is until you have a watershed moment where a pension fund actually capsizes and retired police or fire get IOUs in the mail rather than checks, there's just not the political pressure nor the political will to restructure these systems in a way that makes them financially soluble.
Well, you're absolutely right about that, and that's one of the weaknesses of the pension system, which has created the problem in so many places, which is that politicians could continue underfunding them, and as long as there's a dime in the system to pay somebody, you know, next week, it's fine. I can tell you, first of all, that if you just understand pension accounting, when a system is 25% funded, there's no way back for that system. There's no way to save that system. The reason there's no way to save that system is because 2/3 of the money that we're supposed to be generating to pay these folks is supposed to come from investment returns. When you only have 25% of the money that you're supposed to have, it doesn't matter if you get the 20% return or 30% return. You know, what's the investment return on the 75% of money that isn't there? It's zero, you know. So what happens is the debt just keeps building up, and this is happening around the country. The thing that's most disturbing is at the same time that they are raising taxes because now they have to put money in the pension system and they have to also fund services, is because of this kind of this progressive ideology that's really taking place. At the same time, the money that they are putting aside for services is essentially for ineffective services. They're raising taxes around the country now for homelessness, but they're raising taxes to do things like give people free meals, you know, and build housing for them, but without any services that address the mental health problems. So we have a kind of double whammy, and that's the real problem. You have intractable pension problems, which are an excuse to raise taxes for more services, but the services that they're spending the money on are the kind of services that we saw in the 70s and the 80s didn't actually fix problems. So it's really, you can see the decline. I mean, again, we could talk about Chicago, but you take a place like San Francisco or Seattle, these are incredibly prosperous cities that now are a mess. The streets are a mess. The people are up in arms.
I want to read this excerpt from a noted columnist. You'll be familiar with his name. He writes, "We're all too familiar with the stories of welfare mothers driving luxury cars and leading lifestyles that mirror the rich and famous. Whether they are exaggerated or not, these stories underlie a broad social concern that the welfare system has broken down, that it only parcels out welfare checks and does nothing to help the poor find productive jobs." That was written in 1988 by Joe Biden.
Right. And it was exactly that kind of acceptance of thinking. There was that was the late 80s was a turning point. It was that kind of acceptance that there was a problem in the system, which did lead to welfare reform in the 1990s, which did have a tremendous effect. We began emphasizing welfare to work. And that did have a tremendous emphasis on finding people jobs. And a perfect example is that in New York City, we peaked out in the late 1980s with 1.1 million people out of a population at the time of 7.5 million people, 1.1 million people on welfare. After welfare reform, when the welfare to work programs became pervasive in New York City, we saw this tremendous decline. When Bloomberg left office a couple of years ago, it bottomed out at 365,000 people on welfare. So we went from 1.1 million to 365,000 people on welfare. Those were sensible ideas, but that ideology is now being reversed. The whole definition now is that people need these benefits